This is Keys to the Shop, episode 251, Fermentation and the Future of Farming, with Lucia Solis. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I'm your host for the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to tune in today. Real quick, make sure you're subscribed to the show. Just hit subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And also, if you have the opportunity to rate or review this show, if you love what we do on Keys to the Shop, leave a review or rating at iTunes. Trying to get up to 200 reviews by the time the year is up, which is kind of a big goal. We're like 148 right now. But I believe we could do it. And thank you so much to those of you who have already left ratings and reviews for the show. Those 5-star ratings mean so much. I really appreciate that. Now, Keys to the Shop, on top of doing this podcast, also offers consulting and coaching for you and your business. That means if you are just getting into the specialty coffee world, you're going to open your own shop and you need some guidance. You want some consultation on how to go about it the right way, whether that's menu, bar design, systems and operations, things like that, can definitely help you out. Also, if you're already a coffee shop owner, but you want to scale your operations or improve the systems in your current business, just level up generally, we can help you there too at Keys to the Shop Consulting, whether remotely, over the phone, or in person. I would encourage you, just email me. Chris@keystotheshop.com is the email. That's CHRIS at keystotheshop.com. And let's have a conversation about what's going on in your neck of the woods and see what Keys to the Shop Consulting can do for you. Again, the email for Keys to the Shop Consulting, Chris@keystotheshop.com. Now, today's episode is brought to you by Prima Coffee. Now, Prima Coffee is one of the best specialty coffee equipment suppliers because they're not only passionate about curating the best coffee equipment from all over the world, but they're also passionate about making sure that you get the right equipment for your needs. And they're not just about equipping you with equipment, but also with the information you need to use that equipment well. So if you go to prima-coffee.com, you'll see the amazing selection, but also you'll see that they have a lot of resources, videos, and blogs, etc., that will help you maintain your grinders, maintain your espresso machines, even make better espresso and latte art. They're all about seeing you be successful in the specialty coffee world, and that's why I love working with them, and I think you will as well. So if you're in the market for commercial equipment for your cafe, reach out to them over at prima-coffee.com. This episode is also brought to you by the world's leader in plant-based performance beverages, and that is the Pacific Barista Series. The Barista Series is top choice for a good reason. They test all of their products in the field with the feedback of professional baristas so that when it lands on your counter, that you're going to have a plant-based beverage that will perform the way you really need it to provide an excellent result for your customers. So it stands up to the heat from the steaming process, and it creates amazing texture for latte art. And also, it really balances the beverage, so it's not overwhelmingly tasting like almond or soy, but it helps focus the drink on the coffee. These are the kinds of things that your plant-based customers are looking for, whether they want the almond, soy, coconut, rice, oat, or hemp. There is something there for everybody, and I would really encourage you to go to their website over at pacificfoodservice.com and check them out for yourself. Get it in your store and try it. Have your baristas try it. I think you're really going to like it, and your customers will too. So again, that website for the best choice in plant-based performance beverages, pacificfoodservice.com. All right, everybody. Well, today we have a great conversation in store for you today. Had a conversation with somebody who's really making a difference on the farm level with her work in fermentation. That's Lucia Solis. Lucia specializes in microbial demucilagination, or the use of microbes to produce coffee following pulping, fermentation. She was born in Guatemala, raised in San Francisco, and she studied viticulture and enology at UC Davis prior to working in the wine industry in Napa Valley. In 2014, she started at Scott Laboratories and traveled to Central America, where she was applying commercial yeast strains at coffee mills to modulate flavors coming from the tank. Now, today she is an independent consultant working directly with coffee producers in origin countries to improve processing practices and increase quality. And she is also the host of a really wonderful podcast, Making Coffee with Lucia Solis. I highly encourage you to subscribe to that show where you get to learn a lot about farming and perspectives in farming because she interviews farmers and gets to talk to you about fermentation and microbes and all sorts of fun coffee sciencey things. And we do dive into that in this conversation. We talk about fermentation, its history, and why was coffee kind of left behind a little bit in the conversation about fermentation. Additionally, as we talk about that and her background getting into coffee, we also end up talking a lot about the relationship between the consuming world and the processes and practices that happen on the farm level, because Lucia sees a lot of what happens there as a result of this communication between the market and the farm. And her work is kind of bridging that gap, building a bridge between the two communities and using fermentation as a way to help farmers create consistency and efficiency and ultimately scalability in their product. This has a huge impact on their ability to thrive well into the future. And as we talk about that in this conversation, of course, we hit on the topic of what our role in all of this is. How has our involvement in the trends that we push out there, and how has that actually hurt? And what is a good mindset to adopt in terms of these issues and this tension that will help unlock the potential of what the farmer is doing rather than lock them into something that we want them to do? I mean, there's a lot to talk about here, and Lucia hits on some really key points that you're not going to want to miss. And I hope you get a lot out of this. I certainly did. So without further ado from me, let's get right to the conversation. Here now is my interview with Lucia Solis. All right, Lucia, welcome to Keys to the Shop. Glad to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing really well, and I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to your audience, which I think is very different from my typical audience or who I usually get to talk to in coffee. So I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, as am I. The topic it's obviously related. It's about coffee, but sometimes our worlds from the farm level to the retail level is so distant, and we've got all of our own cares and concerns and our little peripheral stresses. But it's great to be able to zoom into some of these more specific areas and have an understanding of what our people in the same value chain are going through. And so your podcast and your work does a really fantastic job of informing us about what's really going on. And I feel like, of course, this conversation needs to start with how you yourself started, because you have a lot of expertise in both coffee, but you originally were in the wine world and transferred into coffee. Tell us a little bit about your background and what caused that transferring over to coffee.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think the first thing that's the most important is it was not on purpose, and it was not the obvious path for me. In high school, I loved chemistry and biology, and so I was always very interested in science. And when I went to college, I went to UC Davis, and I knew I was going to study chemistry and biology or biochemistry or some combination of that. So I took a lot of those classes. And originally I thought I would go into pharmaceuticals. And then after a couple of years of working in labs in college, I was still working towards my biochemistry degree. I was so lonely in the labs. I just couldn't I couldn't imagine an entire career of just working by myself in the lab in complete isolation. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough as to why a lot more women don't stay in the sciences. Is it's not a very inviting place for women. And so I was, 3 years into my biochemistry degree, and I had no idea what I was going to do because I already hated that career path. And I was fortunate enough to be at UC Davis that has a wine program. So I took Intro to Viticulture, and I was actually searching through the entire course catalog for just anything to fill up some units. And I was down at the V's. So I went from A to V thinking nothing was fitting my schedule because I had these 3 and 4 hour chemistry labs that made fitting in other classes really difficult. So at that point, I just, took the first class that fit my schedule, Tuesdays at, 3 p.m. And it was Intro to Viticulture. And I immediately fell in love. The first class that I went to, I felt like this is something I could do. This is a way for me to apply my chemistry degree to something that is very relevant. And so after like 2 classes, like that first week, I went to the administration's office and I said, I need to change my major to be viticulture and enology. And viticulture is grape growing, so it's a lot of plant biology, and enology is a science of winemaking, so that's more of the chemistry side. So UC Davis has a degree that focuses on both, and my particular minor was a focus on food science. So I studied and graduated with a degree in winemaking, and I was, half an hour or 45 minutes from Napa, so I was able to go straight to work and start working in wineries. My first harvest was in 2007, and I don't know, I really enjoyed it, but I wasn't a wine drinker. I was really fascinated with the science of it. And so I thought I would be happily in winemaking for a very long time. I worked at some really lovely wineries in Napa. And it was around 2013, 2014 when one of my suppliers approached me about taking a job working for them in coffee. And I was very happy where I was. I wasn't looking for a change. I said no initially, but they were very persistent and they talked to my boss. And my boss, I've had a great mentor, winemaking mentor, Michael Salachi, the winemaker at Opus One Winery. And he thought it would be a really good opportunity for me to work for Scott Laboratories because at that point they were a yeast supplier for the wine industry and beer, but they were looking to expand into coffee. So they were looking for somebody to try out different yeast strains in coffee mills and work on coffee fermentation to try and figure out what strains worked best with what cultivars and what flavors, and how we can just really optimize the coffee fermentation, coffee and cacao. And because I had known them for a very long time, because I knew fermentation, and because we had just, we'd been friends, I'd been a customer of theirs for 6 years, they thought about me. And I was like, well, I guess this could be fun. I was very reluctant. I didn't drink coffee at all, which is similar to wine. Like when I got into the industry, I didn't drink wine. I didn't enjoy it. I just loved chemistry. And so similar to coffee, I started to go in that direction. So in 2014, I started working for Scott Laboratories, and I would just take all of these yeast strains in my backpacks and went to Guatemala, went to Honduras, went to Costa Rica, went to Panama, and started trying out these different combinations of yeast on coffee fermentation. And so it's one of the most difficult parts for me is when people ask me, how to do what I do or how to start to get into it or what path. It's really hard for me to have an answer for them because it's like I kind of stumbled into it backwards. I was very reluctant to change because I loved making wine. Making wine was wonderful. But coffee was a very interesting open field where I felt I had a lot more to contribute. So then in 2014, I was still working in wine. I was doing both, and I really burned myself out because the wine harvest and the coffee harvest in Central America are almost opposites. So I was in like 100% harvest mode for 2 years.
Oh, no.
When I wasn't working in wine, I was traveling to coffee, and then I'd come back to wine. And so in 2016, I said, I got to pick. And Scott Laboratories was very helpful for me to have that conversation. And they said, if you want to just only work in wine, you can do that and we'll hire somebody else for coffee, or you can take over coffee and we'll hire someone else to take over your wine duties. And I decided to stick with coffee at that point. And shortly after that, I decided to become an independent consultant and no longer work for Scott Laboratories. But that's a long answer to your question, but it's sometimes important for me to explain why I have the particular perspective that I do and how I approach coffee in terms of like environment and fermentation.
Indeed. Wow. What a road. And it sounds like it was driven by your curiosity and your fascination with chemistry, as you said a couple of times here. And I imagine there's something that you're drawn to in terms of the application of chemistry and the end results of that application. I'm interested to get your take on how that continues to draw you in the use of your chemistry knowledge, and also how you've seen that sort of impact the final product.
Yeah, definitely. I think that one of the first distinctions to make is we all have a lot of favorite fermented foods. I think most people listening to this are either fans of wine or beer or chocolate or bread or yogurt, maybe sake, maybe kombucha, maybe sauerkraut. Like these are fermented foods that are very important that we enjoy in our diet, in our life, in our culture. And I think it's sort of like coffee has been added recently to this group, and it's one of those distinctions that I really resist, that coffee is a fermented food like the other products that I mentioned, because coffee does have a fermentation, but it's not completely necessary. So I think it's like, we're starting to build this baseline where we didn't think about coffee in this way as consumers. We didn't think about coffee in this way of being a fermented food and having this particular step in the process. I think a lot of people who are general coffee consumers maybe don't even know that coffee is a fruit, and don't think, they only really think about it in like bean form. And so I think that there's also been there was like a lot of obscurity in coffee, a lot of anonymity, and now we're getting so specific that we're almost overcorrecting and thinking that coffee is a fermented food, and we're including it and making so many comparisons to wine that are not completely appropriate. And so what I was saying with the other products that are fermented foods, grapes require a fermentation to become wine. Without it, you will never have the final product. Coffee, on the other hand, I say is not exactly a fermented food, because while most of the coffee in the world is fermented, it's a completely optional step. You can completely skip the fermentation step and at the end still have a coffee beverage, because historically the fermentation step was really very little, not very different from a rotting step, where the goal was to get the seeds out of the cherry fruit to be able to dry and then roast and then grind and then make a brewed beverage. So the mucilage was really like a nuisance. It was like the fruit pulp was like this annoying thing that you had to get rid of in order to get the seed out and to be able to make your beverage. So for the entire history of coffee, the fermentation has been completely undervalued and underappreciated. And the goal for everybody in the supply chain has been to eliminate and diminish this step, because it was seen as a barrier to quality, as a barrier to being able to get the seed out. So I think it's important to remember that context now when we as consumers are looking at coffee that we want to purchase, and we are really focusing on the fermentation, on really extended protocols, really long fermentation times, 100-hour, things like that. I think it's important to remember that for the entire history of coffee, that was not the goal. And so it's a little bit of whiplash to say this thing was something we didn't want at all, and now longer extended contact, carbonic maceration, anaerobic fermentation, all these things are really interesting, but we don't have a long history with them. So I think that, remembering that is really important. Remembering that coffee doesn't need a fermentation at all. So because this step was such a barrier, you had a lot of countries like Costa Rica who are, very eco conscious, and they were looking to eliminate the step altogether. So you have the eco pulper, which was developed to wash the mucilage off with water and just mechanical force. And they had really high quality coffees. And so for the entire history of time, producers have been told, don't reduce the fermentation step as much as possible, and that this is a barrier to quality. And so now telling them, no, now we want long fermentations. This is where I felt like I could be really useful in trying to bridge that gap, because now the trend has gone in the complete other direction, but we don't have a lot of information about how to connect the past of how coffee has been purchased and appreciated and valued, and the current market. This current market that wants these differentiated flavors is completely new in the history of coffee.
Would it be fair to say that new, maybe overcorrected, as you say, state of trying to extend these fermentation processes and not completely eliminate them are stuff that seems more in the best interest of people in consuming countries, rather than what seems like the logical step that producers were making to try to eliminate fermentation from their end, so it's more convenient for them. And it seems like we're coming in and saying, well, let's make it more convenient for us and less convenient for you.
100%. I think this is a really important point that we don't bring up often enough, is that completely unintentionally, but the way that the system has been set up, the coffee industry has been set up, has tended to put the producer and the consumer kind of on opposite ends with very different interests. And in my perception, what's been good for the consumer has been bad for the producer, and what's good for the producer has been undesirable for the consumer. And so you've created the system where these two very important players are almost constantly at odds, and yet we have to work together. And I think that doesn't that's shown very clearly in this conversation about flavors and fermentation and quality and preference, much more than kind of other factors in the coffee industry, because it's something we can taste. It's hard to imagine the volumes, or it's hard to imagine a coffee farmer's life, but when you taste cherry, when you taste blueberries in your coffee, when you taste, lime or jasmine fruit, like that's something that you can connect to. So I think that that's why we continue to talk about flavor, and flavor is like a very easy thing to hold on to, but it's not really the most important thing.
Right. So at a certain point, it seems like our obsession with flavors, especially up in the upper echelons of specialty coffee, where one could argue that it's almost, I wouldn't say completely irrelevant, but it becomes kind of a parody of itself. Does it become diminishing returns? So you get to the point where you can control it to such a degree, but now it's so obscure, and not only that, but expensive, and not everybody wants to taste exactly Meyer lemons in their coffee. Where do we balance this? Because you're coming in here building a bridge and helping people with their fermentation processes, and there has to be a balance between these two things. What is your take on that?
I think that the diminishing returns is a very accurate way to frame it, but diminishing returns are a lot more obvious and apparent on the producer side. I haven't really seen diminishing returns on the consumer side or from roasters or sellers, because you can always it's much easier to find a new market or a new audience, or to train your consumers to like a particular flavor. So I think those market opportunities are there, and I don't think it's diminishing returns on the side of specialty roasters. But for producers, these processes involve a lot of investment in either infrastructure or equipment or knowledge, and that isn't particularly being rewarded, or I haven't seen that being rewarded when I work with my clients in mostly Central and South America. I think that, like you said, my intention when I started out is to build a bridge. And over the last couple of years, I think maybe after 2018, I started wondering if I was doing more harm than good, because my focus is fermentation. My focus is on using commercial yeast to there's so many negative connotations, but manipulate flavor is a really accurate way to talk about what I do in terms of bringing out flavors that are inherent in the fruit, but that may not necessarily come out unless we have the right yeast strain to kind of unlock those flavors that are in the fruit. So it's not artificial, but it definitely is a intentional changing of the fermentation. And because that's what I've been trying to do, and that's been my focus, I feel like there hasn't been enough context around what I do and what I'm trying to do. And I think that in some ways I've made the conversation a little bit worse or more confusing, because people are asking for these processes. By people, I mean consumers are asking for these processes without understanding the investment that it takes to get them. And so I've really tried to think about my role and think about how I can communicate better. And I still haven't figured it out. It was part of the reason I started the podcast, was to give context to what I'm doing and how the thing that our preferences, our consumer preferences affect real people.
Yeah, affecting real people. That's another thing too, right? Because our consumer culture is very much based on if we are talking to a barista, we want to add a flavor shot. We want to add an alternative milk or something like that. And it seems increasingly like that's the way we're treating the traditionally producing countries, where we want to order a coffee, but we want to have it like just tweaked this way, just tweaked that way. Whereas the mechanism of fermentation that you're talking about is useful in one context under that mindset, it seems like it becomes weaponized.
I think that's a very appropriate word, weaponized, but I think that the weapons have been used slightly in a different way. Like you mentioned, the consumer's preference for coffee is very vast, and there's a lot of flavors that people are attracted to. So I think that having flavors added to coffee, or having flavored syrups, or having milks, being able to kind of customize our coffee has been part of the conversation for a very long time on the consumer side. But it's only recently that we've been able to see that that level of customization can actually happen at the farm level. That you don't have to wait until the coffee has been roasted and brewed and is in your cup, and then you can add something later. We can add things. We can change the flavors in the fermentation tank. And you'd think this would be a very welcome not innovation, just a welcome change, and that we could, the closer to the source that you can pull the lever, the more change you're able to have. And I've been very surprised by how resistant a lot of people are to my work and trying to change flavors in the tank when we're so accepting of them later on in the coffee shop. I recently had an opportunity to do a presentation for Danone, and it was their R&D team. And so they do a lot of, flavored creamers and things like that. And I talked to them and I said, I'm not sure that I should be, I don't know if this is like the most appropriate presentation for me to give, because my work is about, eliminating the need for creamers and these flavors, because we can do them at the farm. So, you're kind of having me, I'm trying to put all of you out of work, hopefully. And they were a really cool team, and they were really open to what I had to say. And so that was a really interesting experience. But I think that, it's like we want everything. We want to have these flavors, but there's a lot of control involved. And I think that this lack of knowledge of chemistry or microbes or fermentation has definitely been weaponized against producers to say, you're not allowed to change the tank. There's a lot of resistance to, there's a lot of thinking that producers are cheating or potentially tricking consumers because they may be adding fruits to their tank because they are using other yeast, or they're having these like incredible protocols. But that is what we ultimately want in coffee. So I'm just having a really hard time reconciling the consumer's resistance to producers doing this, but then also their desire to have these flavors exist.
That's a great way to put it. We want to pump stuff into a cup for a customer, but we resist it, and we beg for purity at origin, but make excuses for whatever on the other end. It is slightly hypocritical, or maybe majorly. But it makes me want to ask about the balance between really dialing in your offering. Let's say something like an anaerobic fermentation process where you're throwing, like the common one people talk about is the cinnamon, right? Mm-hmm. And, you said we can find markets more easily in consuming countries. But then producers are also concerned with making sure that they have a product that's going to have a broader appeal, or at least from my other conversations with folks working with farmers, it seems like volume and scale is very important for sustainability. So how do you balance niche offerings and really dialing stuff in with also having broader appeal that has the ability to scale in the process?
I think that's a really big misunderstanding of my work. Is I don't want to work on niche coffees. I don't like to make micro lots. I'm very against micro lots. I would like to be much more of a volume person. But however, because of the work that I do, or some of the attention that I've gotten, that's mostly who's attracted to my work, are people who are trying to make competition lots, people that are interested in making, right, like these small standout lots. And that's really not what I'm interested in making. I'm not interested in, elevating the very top. I'm really interested in bringing the baseline up. So my preference really is to work on coffees that are 78, 79 points and bringing them over that threshold to be 82, 83, 84 points, I really don't like to work on coffees that are already 87, 88 and getting them to be 90 plus coffees. I've started to turn down most of that work because I don't really think that it's moving the industry forward. So when I work with my producer clients, I don't look for particular flavor profiles. I think it's another misconception is I'm trying to make my clients' life easier by doing less. So a lot of the times I look at the protocols that they're doing and see what we can take out, see how we can make it even simpler and maintain the same profile that they're getting. Because it's not guaranteed that they will find a new market that's willing to pay more for this coffee. But what I can definitely help them with is make whatever they're making with less inputs. So if I can't make them more money on that other end, I can at least save them resources and make the coffee easier to make. So, in some ways, I'm seen as somebody who makes these innovative processes, but I really prefer to look at the efficiency and say, like, maybe it takes, I have an example of one. I was working with somebody in Africa and in Rwanda, and they were having some naturals that were taking 24 days on the patio to dry. And it was a beautiful coffee. They were very, very beautiful coffees. They tasted great. But what we were able to do was do a fermentation in a tank. So instead of doing a dry process coffee, we were able to make it as a washed. And in 36 hours, we got the same profile as what it took them 24 days to get. Now we changed it into a wash, but the final flavor was very similar to their dry process. And so when they tasted them with their team, they were very happy because now we could just do that in 36 hours. So it's sort of things like that where I think sometimes when we get so focused on the process, we think the process is what gives the coffee the flavor. And we're not talking enough about the microbes and what is really contributing to flavor. And again, the problem there is that you can have producers doing things that are incredibly labor intensive, resource intensive, and it's totally unnecessary.
What is it that opens up as a possibility for that example you used in Rwanda? So now they don't have to wait 24 days for this. What does that mean for them? How does it impact their lives?
Well, one of the things that when you have coffee spread out on raised beds or a patio, that coffee is vulnerable because it's drying in the elements. So it's vulnerable to changes in weather. It's vulnerable to, perhaps an infestation of insects that come and want to feed on the fruit. It's vulnerable to having the available labor to turn that coffee and make sure that it's drying evenly for 24 days. So if you don't have a consistent labor supply, if you can't control the weather, all of these things, if you no longer have to worry about them, that you are less vulnerable and you have a more robust business. So I think that, again, like those are things that the final consumer wouldn't necessarily see, but could go a long way towards the sustainability of that business.
Yeah, great point. I'm struck I'll play devil's advocate here, but it's not as romantic to think about it coming from a tank as it is a raised bed, just drying on this. Doesn't that make a good postcard?
It doesn't. And it is, I think that we just have to update our definition of romance. I think microbes are fascinating. And I think this is a really interesting time because people are more interested in the microbiome as it pertains to even ourselves and our own health. So I think that we can, get a new updated definition of fascination and romance. But even so, even if that transition takes a really long time, I completely agree. It's a lot less romantic. But why is romance the ultimate value? Why is that our metric?
Mm-hmm. The answer might simply be colonialism and exotifying our supply chain overly.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think if we can start to have, more or continue to have these conversations where we can present that information and say your romance is exploitation and start to connect these themes, I think you can start to have the scales fall from your eyes and say, oh, what I thought was romantic is actually very hurtful and very harmful and not even a positive attribute.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So now something traditional like raised beds or things that have become tradition. I wonder what is the breakdown in how those things become tradition? Because in my mind, I'm thinking about now that we're connected, and most, I would say most farmers, but obviously not all farmers, have access to the internet, and there's a lot of communication between the different aspects of the different places of the supply chains. What parts of what you find when you enter a farm and you see what they're doing, how much of that do you chalk up to traditional production processes and trends that people hear about and want to cash in on?
Most of the producers that I work with are very much I think different from the traditional producer because they've already bought in. Like if they want to hire me, they're already interested in doing things in a different way than their predecessors, their fathers, grandfathers, great grandfathers. So it's a very selected slice of coffee producers. But even those producers that are already interested in doing things in very different ways, they are still very subject to tradition. And I think that tradition is a tricky word because I think that's also a word that we can romanticize and think of tradition as something that is sacred and maybe beautiful and, you know, all of these other emotional aspects that you can put into it. But coffee has not been growing in Central and South America for very long. So the traditions, even though it is a traditional way to process coffee, the traditions really came out of just necessity, whatever was available. There's not so much artisanal intention in creating these traditions. It was more, what is our climate like? How quickly can we process this coffee? You know, let's make that happen. So when we get a little bit uncomfortable when we're challenging tradition or we think that we're going to lose something, you know, beautiful and sacred, I think it's important to keep that in context that it's not the same tradition as we may be thinking.
Yeah, well said, well said. And so holding these things with an open hand, and especially when you have loads more people in the farming communities who are open to change, we have to take a cue from them and say, well, I mean, if it's not as sacred to them and they see the writing on the wall in terms of what the next generation needs to be sustainable and successful, then we need to hold it with an open hand too and question some of the narratives we have around it. And
it's very paternalistic to say, you know, if, like you said, if the people that are doing this work are eager, interested in asking for it, I think it's very uncomfortable to say, no, we know better. You should preserve your traditions.
Exactly. I mean, you know, then that's not to negate the idea that there needs to be communication of what the demand is in the market in order to practically sell the coffee. So, and I could kind of think of somebody throwing their hands up and say, well, who cares what I want? You know, then farmer can produce whatever. And like, I thought we wanted to communicate about customer preference to farmers. So I guess in one sense, it's like you can take that idea of, yes, everyone's serving a market of some kind, right? It's just when it bleeds over into kind of putting handcuffs on progress, that's when it becomes a little dangerous.
Absolutely. And I think that we also discount the fact that, you know, we're not equals coming into this. It is much easier to train our palates. Like we are incredibly flexible in what we can learn to like. The first time I tried a beer, I didn't like it. I didn't taste it and think, wow, this is great. It's something that I learned to like over time. And when we can think about consumers learning to like different acquired taste, I mean, it can even be a badge of honor to acquire a taste for something that is, you know, rare or hard to access, versus the inflexibility of a system that producers are working with, where for them to switch over to a new variety, if it becomes a trend, like a geisha or something like that, it can take years for them to, you know, rip out whatever varieties they had before to get seeds or get cuttings of a new one to put it in the ground, to wait a couple of years for that fruit to mature and then to make coffee from that fruit. Or if a new trend of anaerobic fermentation or carbonic maceration for them to acquire the tanks or the specific equipment, I think it's much easier for us to learn to like different flavors and to train ourselves and to train our palate than it is to ask, these producers in these countries to, change their microclimate, change their environment, change their plantings, change their infrastructure.
Yeah, it's an element of hospitality, isn't it? Especially for retailers that, are used to giving hospitality to a variety of different consumers in their coffee shops. It seems like we could do well to look the other direction too and say, well, how can we be more welcoming and hospitable to those that we're getting coffee from?
I love that idea of hospitality sort of extended in both directions. I think that visual of extending in both directions is not something that I see very often. A lot of times, the arrows really flow one way or the other way, not in multiple directions. So I would love to see that.
Yeah. So now, a question, I guess, to delve into the unlocking of potential for a more efficient production of the same flavors, as you were talking about in the Rwandan example. Because of this awareness of microbes you're talking about and how they can sort of take the place of what was traditionally a very passive process over time. Is that something that's pretty new in terms of, science being readily available to apply to an agricultural setting?
The concept isn't new. I think that, that's one of my pet peeves, or like one of the things that I bristle at the most is when we talk about coffee fermentation and attach words like innovation or trend, because fermentation is the oldest form of food preservation. Fermentation was a way for a food to become more stable over and to unlock a certain nutritional value. So humans have been fermenting food for a very long time. Mm-hmm. And in addition, the other products that I mentioned, whether it was wine, beer, sake, dairy, bread, all of those products have been actively cultivating cultures, a culture being a variety of yeast and bacteria to ferment their product, also for a very long time. So the science, the cultural component has been there since the beginning of time. The science has been there for a very long time. And for some reason, coffee has been left out of this conversation. You can think about San Francisco sourdough and how famous that mother culture is and how important it is for consistency and the identity of the San Francisco sourdough to have this starter culture. And yet coffee having a starter culture, it feels there's a lot of resistance to this. So it is a new application of very, very old information. So I think that context is also important.
Okay, so taking something from that's existed for so long from other contexts that's been able to reap the benefit of lots of different iterations and trial and error, with you're pickling something or you're making beer, like you say, like applying that to coffee now. What is it that I know this is kind of a rabbit hole, but what is it that microbes are doing in a tank that can accomplish the job that a raised bed does in 24 hours?
Well, okay, so let's do a really, really rough, really quick idea, because I know this sounds like so bizarre. Like, how is it that yeast actually creates flavor? So if we think about a coffee cherry, you have the seed and then you have the pulp, like this sticky mucilage that's on the outside of the seed, and then you have the skin. So the skin is a barrier to the yeast. The yeast really lives on most of the volume, the quantity of yeast and bacteria that are found in fruits live on the skin, on the outside. So when you have a coffee that's on a raised bed, all of that bacteria and yeast is found on the outside, and it has and there's also very little moisture content. So bacteria work best when there's a higher moisture content. So it takes 24 days for the coffee to get dry. But during that time, as the moisture is going down, as the coffee is drying, some of those yeast and bacteria that are on the outside, once the skin starts to break down, they can eventually start to make their way inside, and they ferment very, very slowly. So this fermentation takes several days to kind of work on the outside. And what the yeast and bacteria on the outside of the skin are doing are basically they're using the sugars found in the fruit pulp, and they're breaking that down, and they are expelling carbon dioxide, alcohol, and secondary metabolites that are the esters and the thiols and the fruity components that we like. So it's kind of a happy accident that, the yeast are consuming the sugar, and I call them like yeast farts and yeast poop happen to be these flavor compounds that humans are attracted to. So when it's on a raised bed, that process takes a very long time because there's a barrier. They don't have such immediate access to it, and there's not a lot of moisture to make this happen. This is also why you'll see a lot less consistency in dry processed coffees, because it's almost like, one little each cherry is having its own individual fermentation. So if we take a look at wash process or even a honey, anything where you pulp the coffee, meaning you remove that skin, then you immediately have a lot more access, a lot more surface area, a lot more moisture for the yeast and bacteria to act on this mucilage. So you're pressing the accelerator on this process, and it doesn't take as much time. So really you're just looking at the availability of sugar, right? So a pulped coffee seed has a lot more available sugar for a yeast to eat than when it's protected behind the skin in a dry processed coffee. So it's not that a wash process in 36 hours is doing exactly the same thing as a dry process that takes, a couple weeks to dry. It's that you have the opportunity to accelerate some of these processes.
So you're taking all the processes that are going to happen in a much slower time frame, creating the same flavor result, as you said, in a very short amount of time.
Right. And so one thing you can do, like I guess the purist could definitely say, well, this is a process that would happen anyway. We are just accelerating it. And then again, you have those other benefits of the coffee is not vulnerable for as long when it's sitting out on a raised bed or a patio. But the other opportunity that opens up is you could create a process that wouldn't happen in by making the environment a lot more anoxic, meaning that you remove the oxygen, and then you would have a very different result than when you leave it out open in the air, which is the type of fermentation that happens when you have a dry process. And I think that's another misconception is people think that the fermentation only happens in a tank. So I'm trying to take the fermentation out of just what happens in a tank and say that all of these coffees, whether it's a honey process or a dry process or washed, have a component of fermentation. It's just how much of it and how quickly that fermentation happens.
Very interesting. I in my mind, I'm thinking about the way that coffee shops approach communication sometimes is very shoot from the hip. It's very spotty. Some baristas have information, others don't, and the experience a customer has as a result is somewhat inconsistent between shifts often, and that's very frustrating. And I imagine the same thing applies in a parallel to the coffee. It's on the farm, you need consistency so that you can have momentum developed so that those efficiencies and those consistencies develop this trust that the product is going to be, like if you have that flavor in the coffee, you're not just going to all of a sudden get part of that harvest that's just not like it at all because it was on having its own little fermentation party on that dried bed. And just like the barista who has the information versus the one that doesn't, it just kind of crosses over in my mind, at least.
I think that also brings up another really good point is, consistency and how important that is to quality. I think that's something that we don't talk about often enough. And I think consistency has really been left out of the quality conversation. And mostly when people mention quality coffees, they're talking about a certain cup score or a flavor profile or depth or complexity. And for me, a coffee that has those things, that is complex and has depth or has an interesting process, but can't be replicated, that doesn't have that consistency, that to me is not quality. And so I think that that's something that I really work for towards my clients when I work with coffee producers is creating protocols that can be replicated. Because the other side of all of this innovation is that because we don't really understand what's going on because there's very little research and very little data that's been collected. Most of it is anecdotal. Then we don't really know what's going on. It's very hard to replicate. And then we're creating these, unique micro lots, which can be good for marketing, can be sold really well, but ultimately, I don't think they're really helping producers create, good reputations.
Forecasting what next year is going to be like, if I'm putting myself in the producer's shoes and I have a happy accident that wins a competition or something like that, it seems like you're saying it's good for marketing, but man, I would be sweating the fact that I wouldn't necessarily know, without having that consistency component in place, like how to replicate that, and therefore it might even just cause more stress.
I think it would, and I'm actually not even sure enough producers are worried about that. I think they should be more worried about that because I think that, people are trying a lot of different things and they're taking good notes and they think, well, I'm just going to do everything exactly the same. If I just do everything that I did before, I get the coffee from the same farm, I leave it in the same tank, I leave it for the same number of hours. If I do everything the same, then the coffee will turn out the same. And there's too much confidence in that because there's a lack of understanding of microbiology. There is a big difference between what we humans are able to perceive and something that could be as slight as a 1 or 2 degree difference in temperature that we wouldn't even be able to perceive, that we could say, oh, it was, a similar climate. That 1 to 2 degree difference could be enough of a temperature change to change the microbes in the tank, and you could have kind of a window open up that would change the percentage or the identity of the yeast and bacteria in your tank. Or maybe if the fruit came in slightly less ripe with a little bit more acidity, well, that change in pH could also change your microbes in the tank. And so even though you, to the best of your ability, are doing everything exactly the same, everything that you did, the day before or last year, the environment that the coffee is experiencing could be dramatically different. And I notice this a lot with coffee producers where they do have their protocols and they are doing everything exactly the same, and yet they still get a lot of different flavors because we're not understanding what variables we should be looking at.
Well, that's really powerful. That it seems with the work you do and where we are in giving or sharing information about what's out there in terms of controlling variables, all these things that had been previously a black box, like me, not sure why it's different, but it is, and you just accept it as a acceptable margin of error, that it could open up a whole new realm of production value.
Yeah, it's so wild to me how much things like that are accepted in coffee, where it's just like, well, that's the way it is, or that it can be kind of charming that, oh, we just get a different result every time. And it's just so accepted. And I'm like, that is not acceptable in any other business, that you just, try your best. And if the result is totally different, then that's just adorable. That's not how things, that's not how you have a profitable business. And so I don't think enough coffee producers are putting enough effort into getting consistency out of their lots. And I think that opens up another part of the industry that I have a lot of criticism for, which is the concept of coffee hunters, of green buyers that are going out trying to find these gems of coffees that already exist. I think that's a really odd culture. But I think that came out of coffee producers being so inconsistent. And so if I'm trying to work with them to increase that consistency so that the need for coffee hunters is significantly reduced.
Nice. Well, if everything is treasure, then we're all rich, right? I'm sure, and of course, you've got an entire podcast and consulting practice on this. There's so much more to talk about in this subject, and I would encourage everyone to subscribe to your podcast and learn that deep dive into these topics a lot more in your conversations. And my final question to you is really, in your conversations with farmers over the years, what in perspectives that you've heard from your conversations have been the most impactful and that we should really pay attention to in, like, specifically the retail world, that would guide how we work and how we relate to that part of the value chain?
That's a tough question for me to answer. Because most of my world is with coffee producers, and I work more with exporters, importers. I work very little with coffee shops, and that I think the biggest way that consumers can kind of interact with this world is looking at their labels, looking at the labels of the coffee that we're purchasing, and what our labels are trying to tell us. And one of the things that I think is dramatically missing from coffee labels are the names of producers. We're so quick to put the altitude of where the coffee was grown, or maybe the variety, maybe the process, maybe labels are starting to say washed or natural or honey, or even the more exotic names that we didn't even get a chance to talk about. But how often does that also accompany the name of the producer? Like, who is actually making this coffee? And when I first started my journey with coffee, I wanted there to be a lot more information about process. Not so much information, but processing in general. I wanted coffee labels to include how this coffee was made and not just reduce all of the production to one word, whether it was washed or dry process or natural. And I'm not so sure about that anymore. I don't know if that's as important, because I think processes are changing. And I think that how a coffee producer makes their coffee, that information should belong to them. I don't know that they owe us to tell us, how many hours they fermented the coffee and how it was dried and all of these things. I think they can share that, but I think too often we just assume that they owe us that information. I'm not really comfortable with that attitude. But at the very least, so I've changed my position on that. I used to think labels should include a lot more information, and now I'm kind of pulling back and saying, I don't know if they should include that much information that could be proprietary and valuable to the producer. But at the very least, I would love to see their names on the label and having that level of connection. Because I don't know, when I work with producers, they're not asking for their name to be on the label, but it's an opportunity that I see that they are rarely able to make their own brand. They're very much kind of under the umbrella of the roaster. And there's been a lot of resistance or like a threat that if the producer has a more recognizable brand, then maybe the roaster is not as important. And I think that this is a really big mistake. I think that allowing producers to have more opportunity to have that brand could only be beneficial kind of for the roaster as well, because they know that they're working with these people. And I've been really impressed with producers that have been able to do this, like Palmi Tucan. They have a really strong brand, and this is a very rare situation. They're a producer in Colombia where people really want that producer's fruit. They don't necessarily want, the roaster. They like the roasters that work with that producer, but they're really looking for that particular producer. Finca Chelin is also another very popular roaster in Mexico, and they make really good coffees, but they're like the few unicorns that have been able to supersede the system, where people are looking for a roaster, but it's like, no, I want that producer. And so I think being able to include producers in that conversation will give them that opportunity to create more brand recognition.
I love that focus of branding, especially in a more connected world where we have the ability we don't have to travel physically to create that reality and take up that real estate, and kind of move away from the private labeling of coffee farmers, in a sense. It reminds me also of Pachamama as a cooperative, like farmer-owned cooperative that has its own brand, for distributed in the United States, and farmers owning things just seems like the way forward.
Well, and not just the way forward, but I think that if we don't have this, we're headed towards a very bleak coffee reality in terms of the market pressures that producers are feeling, climate change, like the pest pressures, disease. There's so many, big waves that are coming. It's kind of incredible. I don't think I've had a conversation this long in a while that didn't involve COVID, but that's also a reality for coffee producers. And so if we don't do this, I don't think it's a luxury. I don't think it's like a nice to have. I think this is going to be quite a necessity.
Well, suffice it to say, we're really grateful to have folks like you doing the work you do to help that become a reality, and certainly learned a lot from this conversation with you. So I appreciate you joining us on the show. How can we stay in touch with you and the work you're doing and learn more?
Well, thanks for asking. Like you mentioned, I have a podcast called Making Coffee with Lucia Solis, and it's a very different type of podcast from yours. I don't do that many interviews. I really will take a topic. If you're interested in anaerobic fermentation, carbonic maceration, we're going to have episodes on bricks. It's a lot more technical. The podcast was meant as a resource for coffee producers, but there are other people in the supply chain who want to know these things. You know, one thing that's really funny is I have roasters or baristas who write to me and they say, "Oh, I received this coffee sample from a producer. It says carbonic maceration. Like, what does that mean?" And then I also have producers writing to me saying, "Oh, I want to make this coffee, and I've been asked by this roaster if I make them a carbonic macerated coffee, they'll buy it. What does that mean?" And it's really funny that like both sides think that the other side knows what they're talking about, but I get to be in the middle, and I'm like, there is very little consensus on these labels. There's very little information, and a lot of times it's kind of the blind leading the blind of. We're like repeating this information. So that's what I try to tackle a lot in my podcast is try to use a lot of scientific studies to tell us what we do know and then also what we don't know yet, in coffee. And then my website is Lucia, that's LUXIA.coffee. And I also have some training videos on there, previous presentations that I've done at SEA. So again, like my podcast is more for producers and people, maybe green buyers who want to know more. But I love, being able to talk to just coffee lovers that really want to get into the nerdiness and the science of their coffee.
Love it. Thank you so much. Building bridges. That's great. Lucia, thank you again for being on the show. Really appreciate the work you do and all the wisdom you've shared.
Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate this opportunity. Like I said, it's such a different audience and it's really fun.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed that episode and that it gave you some things to think about. And ultimately, our mindset towards these problems, where you might not be Lucia and be able to just go to the farm and actually put your hand to changing their situation necessarily, but what we put our hand to today in our store and in a roastery is ultimately guided by, first, our mindset towards what we're doing. And over time, we can make a big difference when we let our mindset be shaped by the reality on the ground, what's necessary for the thriving of all in our industry. The things that we do on the store level will make a difference on the farm level. And again, I really appreciate Lucia building bridges in this capacity through her work with fermentation. So a big thank you to Lucia for joining us on Keys to the Shop. And you can find more information, like she said at the end here, on her website, which is lucia.coffee. That's LUXIA.coffee. And I will link to that in the show notes. I, again, would encourage you to check out her podcast, Making Coffee with Lucia Solis. You can also follow her on Instagram. That is at Lucia Solis. Now, if you have any questions for me or comments, feedback about this show or any other, then definitely email me. The address is chris@keystotheshop.com. That's also the address where you can email any inquiries about Keys to the Shop consulting. Again, that email, chris@keystotheshop.com. And that is it for our episode today. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen today. I hope you have an awesome week. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you Keys to the Shop.